I never thought I'd end up back in this small town. Not after high school. I'd been away for a year, living in the city, trying to figure out my life. It wasn't like I had a real plan. College? Sure, I'd started, but it wasn't for me. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to stay in my hometown, stuck in a loop of familiar faces and predictable routines. But here I was, back in the place I grew up, trying to make sense of everything. I didn't think I would come back to work here, at the same supermarket my grandmother worked at for 30 years. She passed away last year, and it hit me harder than I expected. My parents tried to get me to move home, but I wasn't ready to face it. I thought maybe if I just stayed away long enough, the pain would fade. But nothing did. After I dropped out of college, I needed a job, something to do, so when I saw the opening for a night shift at Miller's Market, the same place she had worked, it felt like fate. Miller's Market wasn't anything special, just your typical 24-hour supermarket in a town where not much changed. The building was old, had that typical grocery store smell that made you feel like you'd walked into something familiar and safe. I figured it'd be an easy gig. Quiet, low stress. It'd give me time to think, to clear my head. But from the moment I walked in, something didn't sit right with me. The manager, Mr. Grayson, was the first clue. He was a strange guy. Tall, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, pale skin that almost glowed under the fluorescent lights, and an old-fashioned mustache that made him look even older than he was. When he spoke, it was in a low, gruff tone like he hadn't slept in days. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked me, handing me a crumpled piece of paper. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I nodded. "Good. These are the rules. Follow them, and you'll be fine. Break them, and—" he paused, his eyes narrowing. "Well, don't." The paper was old, like it had been folded and refolded too many times to count. I took it, my hands feeling clammy despite myself. I glanced down at the paper, expecting to see basic guidelines about cleaning shifts and customer service. But instead, it was a list of 10 strange, cryptic rules. Rule 1. Always restock aisle 3 before midnight, and never turn your back to the shelves while doing so. Rule 2. If you see a customer in the aisles who's wearing clothes from the 80s, don't engage. Just walk away. Rule 3. If the freezer doors are open for more than 30 seconds, close them immediately. Rule 4. The bread aisle is off limits from 2 to 2:15 a.m., don't look inside. Rule 5. If you hear a phone ring at 3 a.m., don't pick it up. Rule 6. Never let the lights go out completely. If the power flickers, you need to get to the main office. Rule 7. If someone asks for help at 3:30 a.m., refuse. They aren't customers. Rule 8. The store's back door will open at 4 a.m. Nobody should be there. Rule 9. The security cameras will show people who aren't there. Ignore them. Rule 10. Do not leave the store after 4:30 a.m. until the morning crew arrives. I stared at the rules. Are these a joke? I asked, trying to sound light-hearted, but the unease in my voice was obvious. Mr. Grayson didn't even smile. His eyes were cold, and his face stayed emotionless. Just follow them, he said. You'll understand soon enough. The first few hours felt like they could have been any other night shift. Quiet, calm, boring even. I tried not to think too much about the rules. I was there to work, not get caught up in weird superstitions. I'd heard stories about supermarkets with strange happenings, but I never thought they were anything more than just rumors. I moved through the aisles, restocking, trying to keep my mind occupied. The store was pretty empty for the most part. 1 or 2 people wandered in, picking up things for late-night snacks, but there wasn't much going on. But then something strange happened. Around 11:30 p.m., I was in aisle 3, stacking canned goods, when I realized I was alone in the aisle, completely alone. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound. I froze. I'd heard stories about people hearing things in supermarkets at night. Sounds that didn't belong. The shelves creaked. The building settled. But this wasn't that. It was more like a footstep. I turned around, scanning the aisle. Nothing. But then I remembered the first rule. Always restock aisle 3 before midnight, and never turn your back to the shelves while doing so. I forced myself to continue, but I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The air around me felt heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was behind me. I kept working, trying to push the unease away. I finished the aisle just in time for midnight. But when I turned to leave, I felt eyes on me. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. No one was there. Still, I hurried out of aisle 3, feeling a rush of adrenaline I couldn't explain. It was close to 12:30 a.m. when I finally started to feel like I was settling into the routine. My mind kept going back to the rules, though. Why were they so specific? Why did Grayson look so serious when he handed them to me? I shook it off. The rules were probably just meant to scare the new guy. A rite of passage. That's what I kept telling myself. Then I saw him. He was standing in aisle 5, the snacks section, holding a box of crackers. At first glance, he looked normal, an older guy, maybe mid-50s. But as I got closer, something about him didn't feel right. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something you'd see in a movie set in the 80s. Faded jeans, a members-only jacket, and those thick, oversized glasses. It took me a moment to register the second rule. If you see a customer in the aisles who's wearing clothes from the 80s, don't engage. Just walk away. My instincts were screaming at me to leave. But part of me wanted to talk to him, to see if he needed help. He was just standing there, staring at the box of crackers like he was lost in thought. I took a step closer. He turned his head sharply toward me. His face didn't look right. It wasn't just old. It was off, like it had been stretched and twisted. His eyes were too far apart, his smile too wide. I stopped in my tracks. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and distorted, like a record being played at the wrong speed. "Can you help me find something?" My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to follow the rule. But I couldn't move. "Sir?" he asked again, taking a step toward me. I finally managed to turn around and walk away, my heart racing. I didn't run, I don't know why, but I kept moving, not looking back. When I reached the other side of the store, I glanced over my shoulder. He was gone. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about the rules. I started to understand why Grayson was so serious about them. It wasn't just about following orders, it was about survival. Around 1:15 a.m., I headed to the freezer section to check on the inventory. It was one of the newer parts of the store, with bright LED lights and shiny glass doors. It didn't feel as creepy as the rest of the place. At least, not at first. I opened one of the freezer doors to restock some frozen pizzas. The cold air hit my face, and for a moment, it was almost comforting. I started stacking the pizzas, trying to distract myself from the strange encounter earlier. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from inside the freezer. I froze, my breath visible in the icy air. It was probably just the compressor, I told myself. Freezers make weird noises all the time. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone was knocking from the other side of the glass. I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. One of the other freezer doors was wide open. Rule 3 flashed in my mind. If the freezer doors are open for more than 30 seconds, close them immediately. My hands were shaking as I walked over to the open door. The tapping continued, louder now, echoing in the empty aisle. I couldn't see where it was coming from, but it felt like it was all around me. I reached for the door handle and froze. There was something inside the freezer. A shadow, faint and flickering, like it was barely there. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed the door and slammed it shut. The tapping stopped immediately, and the aisle fell silent. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that freezer, it was watching me. By the time the clock hit 1:50 a.m., I was starting to regret taking this job. The rules weren't just some harmless prank, they were real, and they weren't playing around. I tried to stay busy, focusing on small tasks like wiping down counters and organizing stock. But no matter what I did, my mind kept going back to the freezer, to the shadow, to that man in aisle 5. I checked the time, 1:58 a.m. That's when I remembered Rule 4. The bread aisle is off limits from 2 to 2:15 a.m., don't look inside. I'd been stocking shelves near the bakery section. The bread aisle was just a few feet away. I stepped back, moving toward the register, trying to put as much distance between me and that aisle as possible. But as I turned, I caught a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye. It looked different. The lights in the bread aisle seemed dimmer, flickering slightly. The shadows between the shelves stretched unnaturally long, like they were alive. I forced myself to look away. "Just stay out of the aisle," I whispered to myself. "It's only 15 minutes. The clock struck 2 a.m., and that's when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like plastic bags being crumpled. It came from the bread aisle. I knew I wasn't supposed to look, but the sound was getting louder, more frantic, like someone or something was tearing through the shelves. I clenched my fists, my back to the aisle, trying to tune it out. But then I heard a voice. "Dan." It was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent chills down my spine. It sounded familiar, too familiar. "Dan, come here." It was my grandmother's voice. I felt my knees go weak. I hadn't heard her voice in over a year, not since she passed. But it wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. "Dan," the voice called again, louder this time. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to turn around. The rustling stopped, and the aisle fell silent. I stood there, shaking, until the clock hit 2:15 a.m. When I finally opened my eyes, the lights in the bread aisle were back to normal. The shadows were gone, but I didn't go near it for the rest of the night. I'd barely caught my breath when I heard the sound that every part of me had been dreading, a phone ringing. I froze, my eyes darting to the wall clock. 3 a.m. Rule 5. If you hear a phone ring at 3 a.m., don't pick it up. The phone was on the counter by the register. A simple landline, black and battered from years of use. I'd seen it there earlier and hadn't thought much of it. But now, the sound of it ringing cut through the silence like a knife. It wasn't just a normal ring. It was off, distorted, like it was coming from underwater. I stared at the phone, my heart racing. "Don't answer it," I whispered to myself, backing away. But as I moved, the ringing grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the phone knew I was trying to ignore it. "Dan." I froze. The voice was faint, barely audible over the ringing, but I heard it. It wasn't coming from the phone. It was inside my head. "Answer it, Dan." I shook my head, my hands clenched into fists. "No," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "I'm not answering it." The ringing stopped. For a moment, the silence felt almost worse. I stood there, staring at the phone, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then it rang again. This time, it wasn't just the phone. The sound was everywhere, echoing through the aisles, bouncing off the walls. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. "Answer it," the voice said again, louder this time. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "No!" I shouted. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the ringing stopped. The store was silent again, but I knew better than to think it was over. I glanced at the clock. 3:07 a.m. I stayed by the register, refusing to move until the clock hit 3:15. When it finally did, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But deep down, I knew the night wasn't done with me yet. By now, the night was dragging on, and I could feel every second stretching longer than the last. The store had a strange, eerie calm that I couldn't shake. It was almost like it was waiting for something to happen. I'd just finished restocking aisle 3, rule 1. Always restock aisle 3 before midnight, and never turn your back to the shelves while doing so. And I was checking the time, 3:45 a.m. I still had another hour before the morning crew would show up, but I was too wound up to sit idly in the break room, so I decided to do one last sweep of the aisles. I made my way toward the bread aisle. The lights flickered again, but I didn't think much of it. That had been happening all night, ever since the power had gone out briefly earlier. As I reached the bread section, something caught my eye. The entire aisle was empty. I knew I'd just stocked it. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. Maybe I'd missed a spot, or someone had come in and bought it all. But no, the shelves were completely bare. I had to check. I reached for the door to the storage room behind the bread aisle. It was a small, narrow space where we kept extra stock. But as soon as I opened the door, I froze. Inside the small storage room, the air was thick with an unsettling chill. The shelves were full, but it wasn't bread. On each shelf, there were rows and rows of empty boxes, like the ones we used for store shipments. But these weren't ordinary boxes. They had names written on them. And not just any names, names of people I'd never seen before. One box had my name on it. I stumbled back, the cold seeping through my bones, my heart pounding in my chest. But then, I heard it. A soft rustling, like something moving inside one of the boxes. I took a step closer, my legs trembling. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't ready for what I saw. The lid of one box was cracked open, and inside was a picture. It was me, taken from the security camera. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My mind was spinning. How could this be? I hadn't seen anyone. I quickly backed away, slamming the door shut. I checked the time, 3:55 a.m. I had no more time to think about it. The clock was ticking. I had to leave the aisle, but that's when I heard something behind me. A sound so faint, I almost didn't catch it at first. It was a whisper. "Don't look." It was coming from the bread aisle. I didn't hesitate. I turned around and ran. By the time the clock struck 4 a.m., I was running on adrenaline and sheer terror. Every minute felt like a lifetime, and every sound made my heart jump. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of the back door opening. Rule 8. The store's back door will open at 4 a.m. Nobody should be there. I froze, my mind racing. I'd read the rule at least a dozen times, but nothing could prepare me for hearing that sound in real life. The door was heavy metal and old. It groaned like it hadn't been opened in years. I grabbed the broom from beside the register, gripping it like a weapon, and started walking toward the back of the store. Each step felt heavier than the last. The door was just barely visible from the end of aisle 7. I could see it swinging open, the fluorescent light from the stockroom spilling into the dark alley beyond. My throat tightened. Nobody should be there. I inched closer, the broom handle slick with sweat in my hands. That's when I saw her. A little girl no older than 8, standing just inside the doorway. Her back was to me, and she was barefoot, wearing a simple white dress that looked out of place in the middle of a cold November night. "Hello!" I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't respond. I took another step forward, my mind screaming at me to stop, to turn around and leave. But something about her kept me rooted in place. "Hey," I said again, louder this time. "You're not supposed to be here." Slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were completely black. I stumbled backward, dropping the broom. The girl tilted her head, studying me like I was the strange one. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. I work here," I stammered. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a child's smile. It was something far older, far more sinister. "You don't belong," she whispered. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The force of it knocked me off my feet, and when I looked up, the girl was gone. The clock read 4:04 a.m. I didn't move until the silence returned, heavy and oppressive. By 4:30 a.m., I was done. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I didn't care about the paycheck or the promises I'd made to myself. I just wanted out. Rule 10 echoed in my mind. Do not leave the store after 4:30 a.m. until the morning crew arrives. But I wasn't staying another second in this cursed place. The store was deathly quiet as I grabbed my jacket and headed for the front door. I didn't even bother turning off the lights. My footsteps echoed on the tile floor as I approached the glass doors, my breath fogging up the glass. I glanced at the clock. 4:29 a.m. Screw the rules. I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, and for a moment, I felt a wave of relief. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights. But something felt wrong. The air was heavy, suffocating, like the world was holding its breath. I turned toward my car, and that's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the shadows at the edge of the lot. Their outlines were blurry, like they were flickering between this world and another. I took a step back, my stomach twisting in fear. Dan, a voice called out, deep and guttural. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The figures began to move, slowly at first, then faster. I bolted. I ran back into the store, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my heart pounding like a drum. The lights inside the store flickered and went out. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, no, no." I sprinted toward the main office, Rule 6 flashing in my mind. Never let the lights go out completely. If the power flickers, you need to get to the main office. The office door was slightly ajar, the emergency generator humming faintly inside. I pushed the door open and froze. The security monitors were on, each screen showing the aisles of the store. And on every screen I saw myself. Not just one of me. Dozens. Hundreds. All of them staring directly at the camera, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles. Behind me, the office door slammed shut. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. The last thing I heard before the world went black was the sound of the phone ringing. When I woke up, I was outside. The morning sun was rising, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I was sitting on the curb, my head in my hands, my uniform torn and stained. I don't remember how I got there. The store was quiet behind me, the lights back on, and the parking lot was empty except for my car. It was like nothing had happened. I glanced at my phone. 7 a.m. The morning crew would be arriving any minute. I didn't wait for them. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. But even now, I don't feel safe. I can still hear the phone ringing sometimes, faint and distant, even when I'm miles away. And sometimes, when I pass by a grocery store late at night, I swear I see shadows moving in the aisles. So here's my advice. If you ever come across a job that has rules like these, don't take it. No paycheck is worth what I went through. And if you've already taken the job, if you're already in too deep, whatever you do, don't break the rules. Because once you do, there's no going back. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more chilling tales.